A frightened girl runs out of the house, reassuring worried neighbors that everything is fine, gets into her car, and drives to the beach. From there, she calls her father, tearfully apologizing for her behavior and repeatedly telling her parents how much she loves them. The next morning, her body is found on the beach. Sometime later, high school senior Jay Height is relaxing, swimming in her parents' pool. Her sister Kelly calls out to her, inviting her to watch a movie that evening with her and their friends Paul and Yara, who are often at their house because the girl's mother is always preoccupied with herself. However, Jay admits that she has a date with a new boyfriend that night, and Kelly wishes her a good time. Later, Jay puts on a fancy dress, applies makeup, and goes to meet her date. A young man named Hugh suggests going to the movies, and Jay agrees. While standing at the ticket counter, Jay proposes they play a game she and her sister invented, the guessing game. The rules are simple. Observe the people around and choose someone you'd like to be. The other person then has to guess who you chose and explain why you'd want to be them. Hugh agrees, and Jay begins searching for the object of his envy. But she can't guess, and Hugh admits that he chose a child because, at that age, they are perfectly happy and can even wet their pants. Laughing at Hugh's preference, Jay takes her turn. She scans the audience and announces that she is ready. Hugh looks around the room and guesses that Jay chose the girl in the yellow dress, even pointing out where she is sitting. But Jay doesn't see any girl. She assumes Hugh is joking, as the seats in that direction are empty. Upon hearing this, Hugh suddenly becomes nervous and asks her to leave with him. Confused, Jay follows him to a cafe where they spend the evening. The next day, Jay tells her sister about Hugh's strange behavior, but Kelly advises her not to overthink it, reminding her that it was just their first date and everything will be fine from now on. The following evening, Jay and Hugh meet again, and they become intimate in Hugh's car. Afterward, Jay shares her dreams with Hugh about how she wants to live, feeling that everything is falling into place for her. Suddenly, Hugh pins her down, and despite her desperate resistance, he puts her to sleep with chloroform. Sometime later, Jay wakes up tied to a wheelchair in an abandoned factory. Terrified, she fears the worst, but Hugh calms her down, apologizes, and explains that during their intimacy, he passed something on to her, something that someone else had passed on to him. Now an unknown entity will relentlessly pursue her. This entity can take the form of any person, whether familiar or completely unknown. But no matter what shape it takes, it always hunts alone. Sometimes it can appear as someone you love, and that's the scariest part. At this moment, Hugh tells her that it's here, grabs the wheelchair, and quickly wheels Jay towards the exit. Jay sees a woman walking toward them. Hugh explains that the only way to get rid of the pursuer is to pass it on to another sexual partner. Then the entity will leave her alone for a while, and if she's lucky, maybe even forever. However, if she doesn't do this as soon as possible, they will both die. He admits that he was wrong to drag her into this nightmare, but now he's trying to help, emphasizing that the situation is very serious since there's no way to hide from or deceive the entity. After this, Hugh puts Jay in his car and soon drops her off in front of her house, where Kelly, Paul, and Yara are playing cards. They see Jay in shock, but before they can react, Hugh quickly drives away. Jay's mother calls the police, and Jay is forced to answer unpleasant questions. She truthfully recounts everything that happened, admitting that she knows nothing about the guy, although she can give the address of the house where he lives. Later, she is sent to the hospital for tests, but everything turns out to be normal, except for her psychological state. The next day, the police search the factory area, find Jay's belongings, but no trace of the unknown woman they saw, nor of Hugh. It turns out that Hugh had rented a house in the city, but now no one knows where he is. Jay struggles to cope with what happened, becoming frightened of anything that seems unusual. Even a simple ball flying through the window raises her suspicions. Sometime later, during a school lesson, Jay suddenly sees an old woman in a hospital gown walking toward the building. Terrified and not understanding why, she flees the classroom. She encounters the old woman in the hallway and suddenly realizes that no one else sees her. Jay runs away and rushes to the cafe where Kelly and Paul work. She tells them everything that happened, remembering Hugh's words about passing something on to her. Her friends don't know whether to believe this crazy story or attribute it to Jay's emotional trauma. Nevertheless, Kelly is deeply worried, and Paul suggests spending the night at their house. With Jay's consent, the group stays over. They scatter to different rooms, but Jay can't sleep and goes downstairs to Paul. He comforts her and confesses that he likes her. They reminisce about childhood pranks, laughing at their antics. Suddenly, they hear the sound of breaking glass. Paul goes to check what happened. It turns out someone broke the kitchen window, but there's no one near the house. Jay panics, demanding they call the police, but Paul dissuades her, arguing that nothing really happened. After calming down a bit, Jay heads to her room. On the way, she unexpectedly sees a disheveled woman urinating on the floor. The woman walks toward Jay and, terrified, she locks herself in her room. Hearing her screams, Paul and Kelly knock on the door, begging her to let them in, assuring her that there's no one else in the house. Jay lets them in and tells them what she saw, but begs them not to open the door to anyone else because she's very scared. At that moment, there's another knock on the door. From the hallway, Yara's voice can be heard, and Paul opens the door. Suddenly, Jay sees a tall man behind her friend, whom the others don't notice. She screams and, in a panic, runs downstairs, grabs a bicycle, and rides away from the house. Jay rides through the night city, but everything seems calm. Soon, she reaches a playground and sits on the swings. The night park is quiet, and Jay scans it, expecting the entity to appear again. Her worried friends eventually find her. Jay cries, knowing that even if she tells her mother, she won't believe her. At that moment, a person emerges from the darkness, but this time, everyone sees him. It turns out to be their neighbor Greg, who knows about the attack on Jay and is concerned about her state since they've always been friends. He suggests calling the police, but Jay asks him to help her find Hugh. Greg puts the group in his car and drives around town, hoping that Jay will calm down and that everything will pass. Later, they go to the house Hugh rented, and after inspecting it, they find a photo of Hugh in the uniform of a prestigious school. The next day, they visit the school and learn the boy's real name, Jeff Redman, and discover his home address. The group then heads to the address. When Jeff's mother opens the door, Jay realizes that the woman at the factory had taken the form of Mrs. Redman. The woman kindly invites the young people into the house, and Jeff is forced to give an explanation. He tells them that the entity torments those who have had intimacy with previous victims. The boy admits that his intimacy with Jay was an attempt to rid himself of the entity since he became a target after a previous encounter with another girl. He advises Jay to do the same as he did. It's clear that the boy is terrified and keeps repeating that if IT reaches Jay, it will kill her and then come after him again. Greg doesn't believe in the reality of what's happening, thinking it's all a prank, but Jay takes the boy's story very seriously. She asks for the name of the girl who passed the entity to Jeff, but he doesn't even remember her name, as the encounter was casual. The friends express their disbelief again, and just then Jeff sees a girl approaching them. He jumps up, but the others admit they see her too. For a moment, the boy is relieved. He reminds them that the entity moves relatively slowly, giving them time to hide. Once again, he advises Jay to pass it on to someone else, though that doesn't always help. Seeing that Jay is on the verge, Greg suggests taking the group to his parents' lake house. On the way, Kelly asks her sister to consider Jeff's advice and pass the entity on to someone else, but Jay isn't ready for that yet. Later, Greg shows Jay a shed where he keeps weapons and teaches her how to shoot a revolver. It turns out that something unpleasant happened between them in the past, and now Greg wants to make amends. During the day, the group goes to the beach. Jay feels somewhat reassured with all her friends nearby. Yara swims, inviting the others to join her. No one notices the entity in Yara's form approaching Jay from behind. Suddenly, Kelly sees her sister's hair lift, as if grabbed by an invisible hand. In the next moment, Jay starts fighting the unseen entity, screaming and trying to break free. Paul blindly swings a chair at her invisible attacker, causing it to release her. They all run to the shed, where Jay grabs a revolver and begins shooting at the false Yara, but the entity remains unharmed and attacks the girl again, breaking down the shed's locked door. Greg, who has come running at the sound of gunfire, sees no one nearby and scolds them for the broken door, though now everyone else insists they saw something. Frustrated, Greg leaves, and the entity, now in the form of their neighbor boy, squeezes through the broken door. Jay escapes from the shed, rushes to Greg's car, and drives away from the house, pursued by the entity, which has again taken Yara's form. Her friends try to stop her, but Jay is too scared. However, after driving only a short distance, Jay gets into an accident and loses consciousness. Later, she wakes up in the hospital with a broken arm. Her friends sleep in chairs nearby, and doctors walk past her room, but Jay can't shake her fear, listening to the footsteps in the hallway. That night, Greg visits Jay's bed, still not believing the entity is real. Paul realizes what happened between them and feels jealous of Jay. 3 days later, Greg visits Jay again and admits that he hasn't seen the entity, even though he's been expecting it. It seems it's not coming after him. Sometime later, Jay returns home and tries to find comfort in her favorite pool, but her anxiety persists. One evening, Greg comes to the house and admits to the friends that he hasn't seen anyone and asks if he can visit Jay. They tell him that she has locked herself in her room and isn't letting anyone in. Paul reminds them that he felt something when he hit the air with the chair, and the door didn't break on its own, but Greg just leaves. That night, Jay can't sleep, and looking out the window sees the entity in Greg's form walking toward his house. She calls him, but he doesn't answer. The entity breaks a window in the house and enters. Jay runs to the neighbor's house and finds the entity in the form of Greg's mother knocking on her son's door. He opens it, and the entity immediately kills him. Fleeing the house, Jay drives away, seeing the false Greg walking out of his home in the rearview mirror. She spends the night outdoors. In the morning, Jay sees 3 young men on a boat at the beach, undresses, and walks into the water. Later, Jay returns home and falls asleep in her sister's room. Paul shows up and offers to take the entity from her, but Jay refuses. She chose Greg because she thought he wasn't afraid. She pities Paul, so he suggests a new plan. The group decides to kill the entity by luring it into the city pool and electrocuting it with appliances thrown into the water. Gathering everything they need, they head there and, after preparing, wait for the enemy to appear. Sometime later, Jay enters the pool and sees the entity in the form of her father. However, instead of entering the water, it begins throwing still unplugged electrical appliances at her. Jay tries to get out of the pool, but is struck repeatedly. Paul then pulls out a gun and fires in the direction Jay indicates, accidentally wounding Yara. Kelly thinks quickly and throws a sheet over the entity, revealing its shape. Paul shoots it, and it falls into the water. The friends watch as Jay struggles underwater to break free from the entity's grip. Paul fires again, and finally Jay manages to surface. Then they all see the pool filling with blood. After these events, Jay and Paul become close. Meanwhile, Yara recovers in the hospital. One day, Jay and Paul walk down the street, holding hands, unaware that a figure is following them. Everything that happens on the screen feels like one big nightmare. It's certainly a horror movie, but one that makes you think and dissects one of the most serious societal issues: the carelessness of intimate relationships, leading to serious diseases and even loss of life.